At the undergraduate level, I teach three kinds of courses. I teach the history of East Central Europe, I teach the history of immigration to North America, and I teach the history of Slovakia. And the latter I teach because I hold the chair, the only chair in the Western world of Slovak history and culture, which is here at the University of Ottawa. My course on East Central Europe, it's the only course I know of in the Ottawa area that's being taught. They would learn the history of, let's say, the Baltic republics, Poland, Czechoslovakia, the former Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, the former Yugoslavia, and of course the Balkans. The whole territory between Russia and Germany, which is very seldom covered by other professors, so I cover it. And in terms of North America, I do basically the peopling of North America, so we start with the natives, and then we talk about all the various ethnic groups who came to North America, both the United States and Canada, and settled here over the last 400 years, and the kind of society, the multicultural society that developed in both Canada and the United States as a result. I've supervised theses on both the history of Canada, that is the ethnic groups in Canada, and also on the history of Slovakia. Two of my current PhD students are writing dissertations on aspects of Slovak history, and three of my PhD students are doing papers or dissertations on Canadian ethnic history. One is doing something on Hungarians, one is doing something on Poles, and one is doing something on Macedonians. The Slovak chair started back in, the idea of establishing a Slovak chair started back in the 1970s when the federal government embarked on its multiculturalism program, and for the first time ever it made available money to establish chairs, ethnic chairs at Canada's various universities, because Canada's universities traditionally did not cover the history of ethnic groups. They only did the major groups such as the English or the French, and they ignored everybody else. And therefore, the federal government made these funds available, and all of a sudden we had an Icelandic chair, we had a Ukrainian chair, we had a Hungarian chair, we had a Finnish chair, and the Slovaks said, well, if all these other ethnic groups are going to have their own chairs, why shouldn't we have one of our own? So they took up a collection, they raised $500,000. The federal government matched the $500,000, and lo and behold, by 1990, we had a chair in Slovak history and culture here at the University of Ottawa. And I was hired as the first chairholder, and I essentially established the chair by bringing in very large numbers of books and archival material, and I also publish a newsletter, an annual newsletter, in which I inform the Slovak community and the academic community of what it is that the chair does. And this, in fact, keeps the money coming into the chair. Well, my primary aim is immigration to North America. I did my dissertation on Slovak immigration to North America, but I'm an expert on basically all ethnic groups that came to North America. I read the literature, supervise students on any aspect having to do with immigration or ethnic groups in North America. I graduated from the University of Minnesota, which set up the first immigrant archives in North America. It's now called the Immigration History Research Center. And of course, I was one of its first graduates, and I'm very well known in the field. I serve on the Journal of American Ethnic History, and I was also Secretary-Treasurer for many years of the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. So I'm fairly well known both in Canada and the United States as an expert in the history of immigration and ethnic groups in North America. When I wrote my dissertation, I studied intensively the Slovak communities in Minneapolis, St. Paul, in Thunder Bay, Ontario, and in Cleveland, Ohio. And my dissertation covered those three, plus, of course, general Slovak immigration to North America. Later on, I had a postdoctoral fellowship with which I wrote the history of the Slovak community in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And later on, just out of curiosity, because I lived in Philadelphia for 13 years, I also did the history of the Slovak community in Philadelphia. And since I returned to Canada, I've been working on the history of Slovaks in Canada as well. And I've written the history of the Slovak community in Ottawa, for instance. Well, while I was here at the University of Ottawa, I've organized two major international scholarly conferences, one in 2002, which was attended by the President of the Slovak Republic, and the entire Slovak cabinet was here. And every cabinet minister presented a paper, because the theme of the conference was Slovak independence 10 years later. How does Slovakia stand? So each cabinet minister responded, presented a paper on how Slovakia was doing after 10 years, and I published that book through a publisher in Chicago. And just 2 years ago, I did another international conference This time it was scholars from all the former Warsaw Pact countries who now have access to the formerly closed archives of the various communist parties. And I invited them to come and present their findings on what was the real cause for the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Warsaw Pact in 1968. What was the background? Why did they do it? Who were the chief culprits, and so on. And scholars from all the former Warsaw Pact countries came, including Russia, presented papers, gave us new interpretations, and that book is about to be published, again by the same publisher in Chicago, Bolchaz Carducci. It's entitled The Warsaw Pact Invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, 40 years later. The first thing, obviously, is we have the National Archives and the National Library here in Ottawa and in Hull, so that's very appealing to students doing Canadian history, for instance. Those are major resources. In terms of our department, we have a very nice international department in the sense that we have professors doing almost the whole world. We have very broad coverage. Certainly Europe is covered very well, but also now we have Asia, and we also have Africa and Latin America. So we have some very talented young scholars, and they're covering basically the whole world. So you can do Canadian history here, you can do American history, you can do any aspect of European history, you can do Asian, African, Latin American, or you can do ethnic and immigrant.